This is Jeremy Clark of JeremyBytes.com, and today we're continuing our look at task and await in C#. This time we'll be looking at the basics of cancellation. As a quick reminder, we are using the task asynchronous pattern, and a task represents a concurrent operation in our code. Now, as we've seen, there's a lot of flexibility that we get when we're using tasks directly, and dealing with cancellation is no different. We've also been looking at the await operator, and we've seen how this is a wrapper around the task process that makes syntax that's much easier for us to work with. Cancellation is also made much easier when we're using the await operator. Now, last time we took a look at some properties on task. This included the isCancelled, isCompleted, and isFaulted properties, as well as the status, which is an enum. This time around, we'll pay careful attention to the cancelled properties. We really want to make sure that our task gets into this cancelled state so that we can easily deal with it when we're consuming the task. So with that, let's flip over to our code and get started. And here we are in Visual Studio, and our code is the way we left it last time. So with our Fetch with Task button, we are checking the status of our task after it completes, and we're seeing whether it's cancelled, faulted, or ran to completion. So we do have a placeholder for dealing with cancellation at this point. But before we can do that, we need to add the cancellation functionality to the asynchronous method that we're calling. For this, we'll flip over to our person repository and take a look at the get method. Now, when we're dealing with cancellation with task, we're really dealing with cancellation tokens. So we need to get that token into our method somehow. And a common way of doing that is with a parameter. So I'll add a new cancellation token parameter, and we'll call this cancel token. And to make sure that our existing code doesn't break, I'm going to give it a default value. Now, we might be tempted to use cancellation token.none that we saw earlier, but the problem is we're not allowed to use this as a default parameter. So instead, what we really need to do is just create a new cancellation token, and by default, this cancellation token will be in the not canceled state. So for our existing method calls, it will just use a cancellation token that's not canceled. Now, how do we use this in our code? Talking about whether a method can be canceled or not is really a much bigger topic, and we might be tempted to check the cancellation token directly because it does have an isCancellationRequested property. But then the question is, what would we do inside of this block of code? Well, we really want to make sure that our task gets into its canceled state, and again, the task status at the end would be canceled, and then the isCanceled property would also be true. But we don't want to deal with setting all of these things directly, so we actually won't use cancellation that way. Instead, we'll use a method on the cancellation token that's called throw_if_cancellation_requested. Now this method will do all of the work for us, so it will put our task into its canceled state. Now you'll notice the word throw is used here, and that's because this actually does throw an exception. But this is a special exception, so we don't have to explicitly catch it. Instead, the task infrastructure will catch and deal with this particular exception. Now, your reaction to this is probably, well, I don't want to throw an exception if I don't have to. After all, exceptions are expensive when we talk about processing them. But in this case, this is exactly what we want to do. We want the infrastructure to deal with all of the details for us. So now that we have this in place, if we were to go back and run our application, we would see absolutely no difference. So if I click on the Fetch Data with Task button, our button disables, and then we'll get our data that comes back after 3 seconds. And the same thing will happen if we click the Fetch Data with Await button. So since it's using that default cancellation token, there's no difference in the way that this code currently runs. But let's go ahead and make some changes to that. We'll start by dealing with the Task button. And for this, what we're going to do is just add a parameter when we call our get method. Notice that this is showing us that optional parameter, so let's go ahead and put one in. Now for this, I'm just going to say new cancellation token, and our constructor has an overload so we can tell what the state of the token is. So we'll go ahead and put in true, which means that we want our cancellation token to be in the cancellation requested state. Now obviously this isn't a good long-term solution, but it will let us test our cancellation process. So let's go ahead and run our application and see what happens this time. So we'll go ahead and click our Fetch Data with Task button, and then we'll wait our 3 seconds. And then we see that our button re-enables. And this is actually exactly what we expect. When we look inside our continuation, we see we're checking the status of our task. And currently, if it's in the canceled state, we just have a placeholder, no actual code gets run. But notice that neither the faulted code nor the ran to completion code ran, and that gives us a hint that we're headed in the right direction. So let's go ahead and add a message box here. So we'll just say messagebox.show, and we'll just put in operation has been canceled. And then we'll go ahead and add a caption for canceled. That way we can tell this message box apart from our exception message box. And we'll do the same thing in our exception message box. We'll go ahead and say exception so that we can tell the difference between these two. Now let's go ahead and rerun our application. And again, we'll click on our task button. We'll wait our 3 seconds. But this time we'll see that we do get our pop-up box. So it does say operation has been canceled. And we do see the caption on this says canceled as well. And then once we say OK to this, our button does re-enable. Now obviously we don't want the cancellation hard-coded in our code like we have here. We'll want to hook it up to a UI element. But we'll do that in just a moment. First, let's go ahead and take a look at the behavior of our await button. So we can see that our event handler for fetch with await is pretty straightforward. First, we disable the button at the top of the method. Then inside the try block, we clear our list box and then make a call to our asynchronous get method. And again, we do use the await operator here, and this will pause the operation until that task is complete. Once it's complete, we load it into our people variable, and then we populate our list box. Now this block of code is in a try block, so if we do get an exception along the way, our catch block will pick that up. Then in our finally block, we re-enable the button, and this ensures that it happens regardless of whether we run successfully or we get an exception. So let's go ahead and add a cancellation token to our get call here. So I'll say new cancellation token, and we'll set this to true, which again will put it into a cancellation requested state. So let's go ahead and run our application, and then click our fetch data with await button. Now after 3 seconds, what we'll see is we do get a pop-up box. But notice this is our exception message box, and we see that the message is the operation was canceled. Now, like I said, when we call throw if cancellation requested in our asynchronous method, it does throw a special exception, and that's actually what's getting shown right here. Let's go ahead and set a breakpoint and do that again so we can look at the exception itself. Okay, and if we look at the exception, what we see is this is an operation canceled exception. Now, since this is a specific exception, that means we can catch it explicitly. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll add another catch block, and we'll catch an operation canceled exception. And then inside here, we'll do a messagebox.show. We'll show the message of our exception, and we'll go ahead and give this a canceled caption. So now when we run our application and click on the fetch data with await button, we'll see that we do actually hit that canceled message box. So what we've seen here is that if the task is in a canceled state, that the await operator will show the operation canceled exception so that we can deal with it on our calling thread. Now again, having a hard-coded cancellation token is not very useful. So what we're going to do is add the ability to cancel the process from our UI. And in order to do this, I'm going to go to our form, and we're going to repurpose our clear data button. Now I won't make you watch me do all of this. So we'll come back in just a second and talk about it. So I've just made a few changes here. I've renamed this to cancel button. I've changed the content to cancel process. I've set the is enabled property to false, and that way this will be disabled when we start our application. And then I've hooked up a new event handler, cancel button _ click. And if we go to that event handler, we'll see that it's just an empty method right now. So this is where things get interesting and a little bit confusing. I know that I need a cancellation token. So the first thing I would try is to create a class level cancellation token that I can use. We'll go ahead and just call this cancel token, and we'll go ahead and new this up. And again, when we create a cancellation token with no parameters, this will be in the not cancellation requested state. And then in my cancel button click event handler, what I would try to do is say cancel token dot set to cancel. And that's where we run into a problem. This list that we see here are all of the properties and methods that are available on our cancellation token. And if you notice, there's no way to set the state on this. I have can be canceled, but if we look at this, this is a read-only property. And the same is true if I look at is cancellation requested. I can read this, but I can't actually set the cancellation state based on this. And there's no methods that I can use to set the state. This was a big stumbling block to me the first time I tried to do cancellation. This seems like the obvious thing to do. After all, our methods and tasks want a cancellation token. But since we can't actually set that directly, it means we need another object to manage our token. And that object is known as a cancellation token source. So if I create a cancellation token source, and we'll go ahead and call this token source, then we can see that we can interact with this in several different ways. So our token source does have a token property. So this is a property that we can pass into our methods where we need it. But more importantly, it has a method called cancel. And this allows us to set our cancellation token into the cancellation requested state. Now you'll notice that there is another method here called cancel after, and this lets us add a delay in milliseconds in case we don't want to cancel immediately. I haven't found a use for this method yet, but it's kind of interesting that it's there. For our case, we'll just use the regular cancel method. So now that we have this cancellation token source, let's go ahead and use it in our methods. I'll start out with our await button. So instead of passing in a new cancellation token, we'll use our token source.token property. And this will hook it into that class level variable we have for our cancellation token source. Now there is a little bit of housekeeping that I need to do here. The first thing I need to do is make sure that my cancellation token source is initialized. So I'm going to new up an instance of a cancellation token source and then assign that to our class level field. Now this will have the side effect of giving us a new cancellation token source every time we click this button. And that way we'll know we're dealing with a fresh cancellation token each time we run this. Now another thing I want to do is enable our cancellation button. Again, by default this is disabled. So we'll go ahead and set isEnabled to true here at the top of our method. And as you can imagine, down in the bottom of our method, we'll go ahead and set this back to false. So after our process is completed, we want to disable the cancellation button. Now one other place I want to do this is actually in my cancel button's click event handler. This will give a visual clue to the user. When they click the cancel button, it will go disabled. That's a little bit of confirmation that they actually did request cancellation. So now let's go ahead and run our application to see what we have. So notice our cancel process button is disabled by default. To start with, we'll just let things run normally. So when I click the button, we'll see our fetch data button is disabled, but our cancel button is enabled. Then when our data comes back, we'll see that our button enable states flip again. So now let's go ahead and click the fetch button and then click the cancel button and notice that it did disable. And then we get our pop-up that says the operation was canceled. And then when we click our button, we'll see that our fetch data button is re-enabled. So we can see that this code was not very difficult. The main thing that we had to deal with was a cancellation token source as opposed to dealing with a cancellation token directly. So let's go ahead and do exactly the same thing to our task method. Now again, instead of using this hard-coded token, we'll go ahead and use our token sources token. And then at the top of the method, we'll make sure that our token source is initialized. So we'll say new cancellation token source. Then we'll enable our cancel button. So we'll set its isEnabled to true. And then down at the bottom of our continuation, we'll go ahead and set that back to the false state. So let's go ahead and run this and see what we get. So again, we'll let it run to completion so that we see that our fetch data button is disabled, our cancel is enabled, and then when our data comes back, those states flip. And then if I click the fetch button and then the cancel button, we see our cancel button disabled, and we do get our pop-up that says the operation has been canceled. And once we click OK, we'll see our fetch data button lights up again. So we've seen the basics of dealing with cancellation tokens with our tasks. And again, the primary thing that we learned here is that we don't use the tokens directly. Instead, we use a cancellation token source. If we just create a token, it's in a read-only state, so we can't update it to a different state. But by using a cancellation token source, we can use the cancel method to cancel that token. And that's exactly what we saw in our cancel button click event handler. We just called token source.cancel, and we let the infrastructure take care of the rest. So today we saw the basics of cancellation when dealing with asynchronous methods. We saw that the cancellation token is read-only. Now we can specify the state of the cancellation token when we create it, but we're not allowed to change it afterwards. Now this obviously doesn't fit most of our needs, so it's kind of a challenge that first time you run into this to figure out what you're supposed to do. The solution is simple. We just need a cancellation token source. This has a property called token, which is our cancellation token, and we can use this to pass into our asynchronous methods. But more importantly, it has a cancel method, and this will put the token into a cancellation requested state. Now we did see how we deal with things a little bit differently. When we're dealing with task directly, we can check the task status to see if it's in the canceled state, or we can check the isCanceled property directly. But when we're using the await operator, we don't have access to the task directly. So in that case, all we have to do is look for the special operation canceled exception, and we just put that in a try-catch block just like any other exception. So that's our look at basic cancellation using task and await. There is just a little bit of a hurdle with the cancellation token source, but once we know about that, it's pretty straightforward. To download the code, view other videos in the series, and to look at articles on this topic, please visit the links in the show notes, or just go straight to www.JeremyBytes.com.